motion coming. I hope it didn't get too wet out there. I started thinking about the smell in 1965. I'd made a collection of 50 little bottles, and in each I had an aroma that particularly excited me, reminded me of something perhaps. I had wax, naphtha, that isn't the microphone, that's just fake. Most of this talk is going to be about fakes, actually. My little collection of perfumes in their 50 bottles: wax, naphtha, blackcurrant leaves, juniper wood, gasoline, motorcycle dope, sat on my shelves for several years, 13 years in fact. I occasionally take them out as one might take out a diary and read entries that one had forgotten and be reminded of times and places. In about 1978, in a very unlikely and neglected part of London, I found an old pharmacy. It had about 200, 300 different essential oils and absolutes in it. I was more interested in their names than anything else. Heliotrope, Frangipani, Styrax, Labdanum, things that I'd really never heard of before. And over the next few months I bought about 100 bottles of these. Well, when you have 100 bottles of oils, fairly soon you start mixing them together. In doing this, I found something very interesting, something that I've subsequently discovered is at the root of perfumery, which is that it's possible to mix two recognizable smells into one smell that is no longer recognizable. And perfumery really is to do with courting the edges of unrecognizability, with creating things that are evocative and nameless at the same time, that call up strong sensations, but which are never specific. This fascinated me, this sense of being able to make something new, something very unfamiliar from things that might be quite familiar initially. And I continued experimenting and became a little bit more sophisticated in my experiments. I bought some glassware so that I could accurately measure quantities, so that I could repeat certain combinations. I started to notice too that some materials were in themselves ambivalent. They didn't have just one nature. They were complex and confused in their nature. For instance, a synthetic called methyloctane carbonate smells simultaneously of violets and motorcycles. It's used in Dior's Fahrenheit. Orris butter, which is a complex fat derived from the groups of irises is faintly floral in small quantities, but obscenely fleshy in large quantities, like the smell between buttocks. Sorry, it's probably me not speaking very loud. Okay, sorry. Civet, which is a derivative from the anal gland of the civet cat, is very sexy until you can recognize it. Then it's repulsive. Can you hear me now? Do you still want to hear me? Now we're getting onto the anal glands of cats. What became apparent after a little bit of experimentation was that there were no reliable maps for perfumes. It's quite different from colour, for example. Colour had several different ways of being described: hue, saturation, brightness. And with colour it was possible to, for instance, visualize a particular milky green, and to say it might be jade or pale turquoise or odonil. It was possible to locate it in a colour space that probably most other people would be able to understand. It's almost impossible to do that with smells. They are not described by any system of that kind. And the landscape of smells is really only describable by comparison. So, for instance, the chemical caramel smells like flint if you strike flint, or like an electric fire when you first switch it on. Vetiver smells like roots or earth. But there's no structure within which you can say that you can describe the relationship of, for instance, caramel to vetiver. They exist separately, and the sensation of them cannot be conveyed to anybody else except by them smelling it. My first theory about my big contribution to perfumery, a contribution I never made and will never make, was to invent a mapping system for smells. I was very surprised that nobody else had done it. I bought the few available books on the subject, and they varied from mysticism to science, and at both ends of that spectrum the descriptions told you nothing about smell. I decided I would try to make a map of the world of smell, and the way I would do this was by trying to create a picture of families of smell. I'd noticed, for example, that strawberries and egg yolks smell similar, that certain kinds of horsehair mattresses and a brewery is a similar smell. I started trying to make a map of these families of smells to see whether I could relate them together. I gave up. I gave up very quickly, in fact, because I realized that the complexity of the map was such as to make it incomprehensible anyway. And it was not a map that could be described in a simple number of dimensions. It was a multi-dimensional map. It was unvisualizable. I wasn't particularly concerned, because what I really liked doing was playing with smells, and that's what I went back to doing, mixing things up and dabbing them on anyone who would lend me a patch of skin. Meantime, of course, I was working with music. Music, on the surface, is a quite different medium. It has a complete language. It's called notation, musical notation. That language is entirely useless to me, and almost useless to most of the musicians that I work with. It's a language that is very good at describing all the things we're not interested in. It describes, for instance, pitch in discrete and finite steps. It describes rhythm in what seems to my benighted vision rather simple way. And it describes timbre in an extremely simple way. It describes timbre in terms of clarinet, violin, cello, and a few other distinct islands of sound. I entered music via electronics, and electronic music doesn't have islands of sound. It has a continuum of sounds. The term electric guitar as a notation on a score is meaningless, because an electric guitar is a different sound according to whoever's playing it. The term synthesizer is even more meaningless. Most of the playing on synthesizers is even more meaningless. But here was a field of human activity that a lot of people were actively involved in, and for which there was no language. If you walked into a recording studio, and still if you walk into a recording studio, what you see people doing is working with sound, not working with the traditional elements of music so much, but working with sound. That's why we have those huge consoles with all those controls on. All of those controls are to do with modifying sound, sculpting and painting with sound. This is really something new. It's not a possibility that anybody had before the advent of electronics. Unfortunately, musicologists looking at what we're doing say, well, everything they're doing has been done by 1830. And in fact, in terms of, perhaps in terms of melody, harmony, structure, it is an old-fashioned pursuit. But my feeling is that if you don't see innovations where you're looking, then perhaps you're looking in the wrong place. The musicologists have no language for the thing that we are doing, and consequently don't really notice it. I started thinking that actually music was in a very similar condition to Perfume. It had this language, this archaic language, which describes another kind of music, another way of working with music. But the current condition of music is very similar to the current condition of perfumery. It's all to do with guesswork, hunches, and empirical response. You can put things together and see how they work. You can try out combinations, evoke new sensations, but you can't really describe what you've done. The only adequate description is the experience of the sound itself. So now I was dealing with two areas of my life that were unmappable, uncertain, confused, unstable, and empirical. All of the elements of those areas, although they might have names, were shifting, were evolving. For instance, in perfumery, the name coriander meant one thing in the coriander I bought in Paris, but quite a different one on the one I bought in London. So I came to think that coriander describes a fuzzy space in my smell experience, an approximate area, rather than a specific thing, just as synthesizer describes an approximate area, a fuzzy space in my sound experience. In January, I was invited to Brussels to talk to some businessmen and politicians from the EEC about the future of culture. I had 30 minutes to do it in. I couldn't assume that we necessarily shared the same assumptions about what the future or culture might mean. So I thought it was important to begin my talk by looking at those questions. I said, culture is everything we don't have to do. We have to wear clothes in this climate, but we don't have to evolve Levi's and Yves Saint Laurent. We have to eat, but we don't have to evolve Nouvelle Cuisine, Sichuan cooking. We have to perhaps get our hair cut to keep it out of our eyes. Not a problem in my case, but we don't have to have hairstyles. A great deal of the things that humans do are stylistic, are quite beyond the needs of survival. What's interesting is that we don't know of a human group that is able to master the most basic aspects of survival that doesn't engage in stylistic behavior. As soon as people can feed themselves, it seems, they start making choices about how they decorate themselves, how they prepare things, how they present themselves to each other. It seems to be something that we're very involved in. It's not just an add-on, it seems to be biological. I asked the question of the politicians, why do you think we do this? What's the value of it? Of course, I answered the question as well. I said, let's look at something a little less complex, perhaps, than a Picasso or a Rembrandt. Let's look at a haircut. Why do we have one kind of haircut rather than another? What happens to you when you choose to get your hair cut in a particular way? What you're really doing is saying to yourself, I want to try being the kind of person who would have this kind of haircut. It's rather a complicated and interesting construction. For instance, I want to try being the kind of person who'd have long, shaggy hair that flies in the wind. I'd love to join you, actually. Or on the other hand, I want to try being a feminine man. Or I want to try being a woman with a very masculine haircut. When you do something like that, you don't do something that only sits on the top of your head. You make choices about the kind of person you would like to be and the kind of behavior you would like to aspire to. Let's look at another cultural item, say a Rambo film. I choose Rambo because I assume we've all seen all of his movies, even though none of us would admit to it. When you go to a Rambo film, you look at a world. It's quite a simple world. It's a world where there is a very easy distinction between right and wrong, and it's very clear who's on which side. It's a world where certain types of response to situations are promoted, explored, and offered as adequate or inadequate. If you go and watch that film, if you accept the assumptions of it, which you may not, but if you do, what you do for a while is engage in that world. You imagine yourself in that world, and you check your sense of the hero's action to the situation. You discover whether you find that appropriate, whether it makes a message for you, whether this is your picture of the world, whether this is the way you would deal with the world. In that sense, a cultural artifact is a kind of simulator. It's a way of engaging in a situation without having any of the risks of real engagement. This is very important because engagement without risks allows us to engage fully. Of course, we're going to have risky engagements in our lives. We're not short of them. But in an insulated cultural space, we're capable of making rather wild choices and seeing what happens to us. If it was wrong, it will grow back. In the meantime, we discover what it's like to be the kind of person who would have that kind of haircut. So I said to the businessmen that I saw culture as a space for experimenting with other behavioral possibilities. Then the other question was the future of culture. Well, what's the past of culture first? The classical view was very hierarchical. There were many cultural objects, but they were very clearly organized. Dante, Shakespeare, and Goethe would be at the top. Beethoven, people like that. Pygmy singers, walking stick carvers, Balinese gamelan players, Prince, actually another pygmy singer. They would be considered marginal, of marginal cultural value. In the hierarchy of cultural objects that the classical art historian would look at, there would be very little doubt in his or her mind about which ones were at the center of the story and which ones were at the edges. The job of an art historian was to connect these together, to tell that story, the history of art, the history. as if there were only one. The art historian lined up these cultural objects and told a story of progress of some kind or another. The picture of this power line, this cultural power line, was that proximity to it carried with it connotations of longevity and value, ultimate value. The valuable objects were the ones closest to that line. The less valuable objects were the ones further from it. So, as in this diagram, though there would be a field of events, only some of them were important. And there was a good consensus about which ones those would be, and some wrangling about what the ranking might be within those. So the history of art is really the history of people defending one or another line that they drew through what they saw as the center of culture. Central to this idea is that behind it all there is an intrinsic value, and that this value shades away as it goes to the edges. As it goes to the edges, we're faced with things that are more casual, more ephemeral, less well evolved, less finished. Generally to be taken much less seriously. At the center of the line, we have the thing called art with a capital A, which is the position of greatest power and greatest energy. Art, capital A, was seen as a quality that certain things had. The question, is it art? Of course, is still occasionally asked. The question, is it art, assumes that things are or are not art. It assumes that art is a quality that resides in some things and not in others. What I said to the people in Brussels was that this view, more than anything else, is what has changed in this century. Ever since Marcel Duchamp put a urinal in an exhibition, the message has been that an artist is somebody who creates the occasion for an art experience. This is rather different from the classical message. The classical message is an artist is someone who puts art into something. He takes this object, this lump of stone, and he hacks it about until what is left is art. This stuff, whatever this stuff is, flows through him into it. This is still the picture I think that most people hold in some way or another. Duchamp made a very deliberate and deliberately arbitrary choice of the urinal. He chose something that was commonplace, deliberately irreverent, stylistically uninteresting, and most importantly, quite arbitrary. And he put it in an art gallery, and he dared people to have an art experience with it. I had an art experience with it, actually, myself, but that's another story. Actually, this is all another story, really. The change that happened when Duchamp did this is that some people started to think, yes, art is not a quality that resides in things. but is the name of a transaction that I, as an observer, can have with something. If you accept this idea, and you accept the idea that the job of the artist is to provide an occasion for this to happen, however he does it, you've really opened up the notion of what an artwork is. First of all, there is no absolute condition. This microphone could be the occasion of an art experience for me for the next couple of minutes. Let's hope it isn't, but it could well be. It need not be for you, and it need not ever be again for me, but it could have been for that time. A Mondrian painting could be the occasion of an art experience for a very large number of people for a very long time. If we accept this idea of a transaction, art being the name of an experience, what happens is that the cultural pyramid that we saw in the classical view collapses completely. All that we can say is that some people like some things for longer than they like other things. And there are quite arbitrary reasons why that might be the case. Cultural momentum, for instance. If things get put in museums, people see them. It's quite simple. There need not be some sense of greater intrinsic value that creates that momentum. After my talk in Brussels, somebody said, "So do you take everything equally seriously? Is it all art to you?" And I said, "No, not at all. I make choices and I have preferences. But what is the case is that I cannot sustain a good argument for my preferences over anyone else's. I cannot justify one particular line drawn through the cultural space. And I can't question any line that anybody else might draw. What I see instead of there being one line, many lines, lots of ways of looking at this field of objects that we call culture. Lines that we might individually choose to change every day. I might choose that line one day, that one another one. The objects in my lines, the concepts, the carved walking sticks, the Prince records, might change their value depending on which story they become a part of. If I'm looking at the breakdown of focus in painting, the Prince record doesn't have much of a contribution to make there. If I'm looking at the advent of sensuality in music, it makes a big appearance. All of the items of culture in this new view of culture have negotiable value. They don't have one value any longer. They don't describe one point in the cultural space. Their weight changes. This connection making is really a form of storytelling. One line through our culture is a story about it. one set of choices you choose to make is a story about you. You choose these records, these cookery books, this kind of colour paint, this kind of furniture. All of these are some kind of cultural experiment that you're making. They're experiments that you can change your mind about. They're flexible. You don't have to commit yourselves to them in any permanent way. You can shuffle them. We all do a lot of shuffling. We're confronted with so many cultures and so much of the past of our own culture that it's impossible to any longer be doctrinaire about choices in them. We cannot any longer sustain this pyramid picture of culture. This has really given rise to a new personality. I call him the curator, but actually perhaps that's the wrong word. The storyteller might be better, and the storyteller is a much older word. A storyteller is someone who weaves together a perspective. I don't know if you've noticed in going to exhibitions in the last few years that the curator's name gets a bigger and bigger typeface. I went to an exhibition in Berlin a few years ago which said something in German, curated by a name that large, with works by people that large. And I thought this was a very, very interesting idea, that the person who made the choices should be credited as the person who had created a work, the work being the whole of this exhibition. The whole of that exhibition was a cultural picture of some kind. I wondered who the other curators in our culture were. Well, DJs, of course, and other spin doctors, editors, cameramen, journalists, models, futurologists, stylists. These are jobs that have in the past been seen as rather on the edge of creative culture, I would say. So the really creative people sat in the middle, and these people on the edge tinkered with what they did and somehow presented it to the public. But I think that picture is changing now. I think those people who were considered marginal suddenly start to have a big role, because the role of digesting, of creating possible packages from the huge plethora of stuff that's around, becomes a very, very important job. It becomes a job, actually, that we start to pay very well for as well. The storytellers really are saying, here's a line that you could follow through our culture. Here's a possibility. Here's a style you could adopt. And styles are terribly complicated now. They're not just haircuts, they involve all sorts of choices. And each of those choices has resonances. It's not in an aesthetic vacuum. It's not just something you do because you like it. Because you like it is a very complicated phrase. You like something for all sorts of reasons. And the task of putting together what was in the 80s called a lifestyle preoccupies us. The picture of this culture then is actually a lot like the picture of perfume and the picture of music. Instead of seeing a culture that is nicely organized and stable, where elements have their value and rarely change their value, we see a culture that's filled with objects that keep changing place and keep changing status, that interpenetrate, that take on different values depending on who's telling the story. We see a culture that offers as its primary material confusion and uncertainty, not stability and security. A culture where every space is fuzzy, where there are no hard distinctions. That doesn't mean that we have to turn into New Age hippies. It means that we make distinctions, but we make them with a certain kind of irony. We make them knowing that they are not ultimately defensible. They don't translate into some kind of absolute language that everybody would in the end agree with if they had enough time to see our point of view. This, funnily enough, was the classical view. The classical view was that in the end, any reasonable person would like Bach. There were tragic stories of missionaries appearing in Africa with gramophones and trying this experiment. And the pygmies made flower pots from them and things like that, as any reasonable person would. But the assumption was that any reasonable person would finally agree on one way of describing the reality of culture, the reality of culture. This picture has really changed now, I think. We really don't expect to see books now that are called The Art of the Novel, The History of Painting. There isn't one of any of those things. There's a history of painting, and there's another history of painting, and yet another one. So it seems that what I discovered in perfume, subsequently in music, I now come to believe is true of the whole of culture. The space is fluid. This has an effect on the way we think about the world. It predisposes us, I think, to not think in terms of capital letter words. Freedom, justice, things like that, as if these were identifiable and locatable items in the way that I described art earlier on. Instead of that, we start to think, I believe, in terms of networks of confidence. Think of something like the GATT talks, General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs. This is probably one of the most important discussions going on in the world today. It's the set of discussions that will determine how world trade interpenetrates, how we import and export, how we don't destroy each other's markets. It's a huge and very, very complex set of agreements. These agreements have no absolute basis. They're not reducible to any set of laws or rules or mathematics. they eventually are just agreements. They're statements of confidence of some kind or another. A lot of the things that we do now are statements of confidence. All of our currencies are statements of confidence. They're not backed by anything. If you go to a bank with a £20 note and say, I want to redeem this, you'll get £4 or £5 notes. You won't get a bar of gold or something tangible. All of our currencies are backed by trust. This is a very interesting idea, I think, because it leads me to believe that the most important evolution that humans have been undergoing for the past 2,000 years at least is the gradual evolution away from absolutes and principles towards ephemeral confidences, networks of belief, understanding, and empathy. Empathy is the thing that we do really well. And empathy is, funnily enough, what underlines the gap talks. Trust and confidence, strangely enough, underlines the stock market and the art market. Those are markets of confidence. They're markets of structures of belief in the value of something. Value, of course, is negotiable, and everybody knows that. That's why those markets fluctuate. It's confusing, perhaps, to live in a world that doesn't have any final rules, that doesn't hold out the hope that eventually reasonableness will persuade us all on to one course of action. It's confusing to be faced with a situation where perhaps there isn't one final philosophical language that we will all speak in the end. But quite the opposite. There's an increasing proliferation of languages which interpenetrate, which cross over one another, which interfere with one another. It's confusing because we never know whether we're right. All we can do is make experiments, make guesses, see how they work out, try to describe this space we've created to somebody else, try to inhabit it, see if it works, change bits of it. Of course, there are lots of ways of retreating from that. Nostalgia, mysticism, paranoia, survivalism. Those are all ways of shutting out the problem of dealing with uncertainty, of dealing with confusion. The way of dealing with it, I suppose, is to learn to improvise, to be alert, to watch for these changes that are always happening in the flux that we call culture, modern culture, to act on hunches rather than on principle. It's a different kind of future. It's very chancy. It's very exciting. And in that future is the biggest struggle that that we've seen for a long time, the struggle between fundamentalists, people who don't want that future and who don't believe in it, and who desperately want to prevent it from happening, and people who we might call pragmatists, I don't know if there's a better word. The fundamentalists I call routists. Routists are people who think that they'll find the roots in the end. I'm a non-routist in that I don't think I will. Well, the end of this part of the talk is that I've stopped expecting a future where perfume will find its place in a neat system of classification. Instead, I'm waiting for everything else to become like perfume. Thanks. Whatever the world that I tried to describe just now, the world of flux and change, of things in motion, instability, uncertainty, defense wants the opposite world. Defense is the way that we try to stabilize the world. We try to prevent the perfume world from happening. I want to ask the question, what is defense defending us against? Why do we spend so much money on it? I read the other day that the annual budget of the World Health Organization is equivalent to 2.5 hours defense spending. %55% of Britain's research and development money goes to defense. We obviously take this very seriously. Even more seriously than the Royal Opera House, actually, which only gets 50% of our Arts Council money, I think. Well, there are simple answers to why we spend so much money on defence. The simple answer is because there are a lot of greedy defence contractors and a lot of paranoid politicians, and they make a powerful combination. I think there's another story behind this. It's a story that interests me because it doesn't assume malice or greed or paranoia. Those explanations are fine and obvious and probably not wrong because of that. But we've heard them before. I want to imagine a president who's really a nice chap. Somehow or another, this guy got elected. He's clever, alert, forward-looking, actually a pacifist. His name is Dickie Dove, actually. And suddenly he's in the White House. Of course, he has a vision of the future. And of course, part of that vision is technological. He wants to see the country as a great power in the future. He doesn't want it to slip behind. He wants it to be at the forefront, at the cutting edge. He wants it to be a great country to live in. That's reasonable enough. He has the best advisors in the country. He has several think tanks working for him. He has information that none of us have access to about the future. He knows a lot. He is in a position, he believes, to make good judgments about what's going to happen. A lot of his judgments will be technological. His advisors tell him, Dickie, the important things for the future we understand from these guys at Stanford are parallel processing computers, advanced laser technologies, noble metals research. But they're not going to show results for 15 years or so. So what does the president do? Does he come out to the country and say, we've got this great idea for parallel processing computers. I know you need a hospital, old people's homes, new schools, better roads, but parallel processing computers are where it's really at. I mean, we're not really sure, but we think in 15 years' time that's where it's going to be at. Well, maybe not 15, could be 25. We're not quite sure. What chance would Dickie's program have of being carried through? These people here, all citizens, Democrats, say, I think we should be looking after crime. We want more policemen. No, I want a hospital. Old people's homes, education, and so on down the line. So Dickie's big budget for parallel processing computers gets cut into lots of little pieces, which go into projects that don't benefit Dickie's technological dream. This is called democracy, you see. But now, another scenario. Dickie has a defense program. Defense program is very valuable for him because it's secret, for one thing. He doesn't have to tell on which basis he's made those decisions. He says to these people, we're in a bad situation. There are threats all around us. Paraguay might invade any moment. There are all kinds of rumblings in Fiji. You never know. We need those 4 Trident submarines. And they're only $27 billion each at the moment. Dickie knows he doesn't need 4 Trident submarines. Especially to ward off Fiji. We could probably do that here on this stage. And there are no longer any other credible enemies. But what Dickie does need is a way of supporting all of his technological programs. Of course, he gets every encouragement. The defense contractors are very pleased. The economists are very happy because the economy has kept turning. Lots of people are kept in work. There's every conceivable encouragement for him to take this course of action. Now, to give you 2 examples of programs like this, Star Wars. Star Wars, within a few months, was dismissed by the Pentagon itself as militarily useless. There was considered to be very little chance of a useful result from that. because they were taking the narrow view. There was a very useful result as far as Dicky Dub, or in fact Harry Hawke as it was in that occasion. The very useful result was that most of the population of California was kept at work on defense contracts, and a lot of very advanced research into extremely sophisticated computer applications were allowed to take place under the aegis of this. So, what is defense actually defending us against? The first theory, then, is that defense is defending us against democracy. We always used to think it was defending democracy. It isn't. It's actually defending us against it. It's defending us against your short-sightedness. You can't understand why parallel processing computers are more important than old people's homes. Defense defends a government against its people's empathies, not their enemies. But that isn't really what's happening. Defense isn't defending us against democracy, actually. It's defending us against the consequences of an inappropriate language. All governments frame their claims in an old language. That language is the language of capital letters. I've mentioned it before: freedom, justice, democracy, truth, liberty, and the enemies are communism, totalitarianism, none of other, so on down the line. The world isn't like that. The world is in motion, in flux, and this grid doesn't describe anything any longer. There's a gulf. In fact, that's the real gulf crisis, the difference between the language of politics, the necessary language of politics, actually, and what happens. People expect those words, they like those words, they're inspired by those words. Politicians are too timid not to use them. They want to get elected. No politician's going to stand up and say, well, you know, I'm sort of a Democrat, but occasionally I'm going to actually have a bit of a command economy here. Defense is a command economy. One way of looking at defense is saying it's a form of socialism that is concealed at the heart of capitalism. I've got nothing against socialism. The problem is concealing it. It's concealed, it warps a process, because the only way of doing that, of making that work, is by somehow circumnavigating your own claims. Defense is really a language for negotiating the shortcomings of our absolutist concepts, of our old pictures of the world. Its problem is that it's dangerous. You may have noticed. All those things really shoot. Can we visualize any kind of future ask this as a rhetorical question. I don't know the answer. Can we visualize a future where citizens can be inspired by vague ideas? Where they can be inspired by politicians who dare to say, I'm not certain. I don't know what kind of future we're going to have. Sometimes I might have to be a socialist. Sometimes I might have to be a capitalist. Sometimes I might have to believe in the market. Sometimes I might not have to. Is this conceivable? Can we live with the uncertainty of that? This talk and the one before are both about living with uncertainty, developing languages for uncertainty. The next section will be about an uncertain situation. Thanks. Thank you. To be a private affair. Just a few dozen close friends and the complete staff of Hello magazine, to whom all the photo rights had been sold. Aware that the paparazzi might catch wind of this celebrity wedding in Florence, the local police had detailed a helicopter to discreetly circle a few yards above the church for most of the morning. By early afternoon, as the guests began arriving at Florence airport from the perfume capitals of the world, London, Los Angeles, New York, Paris, and Rome, all the streets for hundreds of yards round were impassable. Cleverly disguised 6-7-inch bodyguards with wraparound reflective shades and strangely lumpy black suits drove flying wedges into the enthusiastic crowd, so that the guests, now slightly bedraggled from the persistent rain, could be fed smoothly into the church. Large white sheets had been hung over the front so that there were no contract-invalidating camera angles even through the door as it opened to allow us inside. Inside, there was a whispering silence as people who hadn't seen each other for many years now met again in the pews of this rather austere church. We arrived almost last, and there was hardly anyone there I recognized. Only the front third of the church was occupied. A printed order of service on each pew announced the wedding and the schedule of events. The photographers and film crews swished delicately around the edges of the church, like elaborate snakes. Of course, there were no flashes, no motor drives. A song, Evening Gathering, from the Mystère de Voix Bulgare, began playing, and the murmuring in the church evaporated as sentences were hurriedly finished. Everybody expectantly faced the altar. At last it was beginning. From a small door at the front of the church, the groom, in classic black, emerged with his best man, and they stood together facing forward. The priest then followed them out from the same door and stood facing them. Nobody spoke. Then, quite suddenly, and at a musically appropriate moment, the groom turned his torso anti-clockwise through about 50 degrees, leaving his right foot still, pointing towards the altar, but moving his left such that it made slightly more than a right angle with it. The body was thus oriented on a diagonal. On a line drawn from the far right corner of the church to a point halfway up the left side. The groom's head, however, was turned further, thrown back along a line over the shoulders, such that its attention was directed to the heavy dark door at the back of the church. The groom made no acknowledgement whatsoever of any member of the congregation, as though they had become invisible to him. The facial expression was quite fixed, but very eclectic. There was expectancy, of course, and anticipation. There was exultation, awe, and even disbelief. But the really clever addition was just the right note of apprehension, foreboding, of the disquiet that accompanies the consciousness of approaching moral imperative. This wasn't an expression of simple contentment, all sweetness and light, but one carefully accented with the awareness of contingency, of danger, of shadow. The attempt to interpret it transfixed the whole congregation. The chord of emotional resonance was so carefully tuned into a complex, near-perfect bouquet that the sustained and resonant hum of its pathos vibrated through the church. The only slightly inconsistent note was a faint redness to the groom's face, the result of a too recent suntan, no doubt, but unfortunately incapable of being read as a blush. Why was this note inappropriate? Because a blush suggests embarrassment, which in turn raises the possibility of something that would rather be concealed. But the whole reading of the facial expression was otherwise quite contrary to that. It was an expression which said, "Now you are seeing all that I have to show you, all the doubts, all the tensions. I trust you will understand." Yes, it was an expression of trust, a sharing of confidence, sent out as a message to the community and, via Hello magazine, to the whole of the watching world. The groom held his sentry position for what seemed 4 or 5 minutes. The intensity of his gaze into the gloom at the back of the church finally forced all other eyes to focus there too, reluctantly tearing themselves away from him and onto the heavy, unyielding door. There was no movement. The Bulgarian voices hung melancholy in the air. Even the snake-like cameramen were almost still in this strange oasis in time. In this afternoon gathering in an American Catholic church in Florence, where we had come to witness the wedding of a Protestant to a Muslim in a Bulgarian village. Where were we all those minutes? We were thinking, when is she coming? Is he really sincere? Is this a real event or the depiction of an imagined event? Is this a church or a theatre? Is there any difference? Is the priest in on this? Is this being done mainly or solely for the cameras? Is the wedding happening here or in Hello magazine? And what is the difference? As we pondered these uniquely modern issues, we could hear the clamour of the world outside. A faint hysterical piping pinging off the heavy grey walls of the church, skittering over our oasis of emotion. We couldn't forget that we were on the inside. We couldn't understand of what. And then the big door creaked open. There stood the bride, that most perfected creature. Her eyes cast downward to a point just in front of her. She was with her father, a tall, elegant man, and she matched him in height. She wore a full-length golden satin dress, and a glorious mane of Botticelli copper hair tumbled like some glittering viscous liquid down her back. Together, father and daughter began their incredibly slow movement down the aisle. There was something Japanese, kabuki-esque, yes, no even, about it. She took steps of no more than 4 inches, her feet and eyes never leaving the ground, her feet never appearing to touch the ground, slowly making her way over the endless silent desert at the back of the church. Again, the expressive blend was utterly superb. Eagerness, self-esteem, respect, reluctance, shyness, grace. And as she reached and began to move between the pews where we stood, one sensed a slight quickening, as though a magnet drew her closer. The orchestration was remarkable. We were all intensely moved. She reached her groove as the last chords of the music drifted up into the eaves of the church. They touched and stared long and close at each other. The messages were again complex, manifold, richly self-contradictory. My joy knows no bounds, but also, is this the right type of smile? Am I worthy? How long should we hold this position? One sensed some allowance for improvisation at this point, now that the delicate, hauntingly dissonant mode of the raga had been stated. As we watched this wedding proceed, we wondered, how much performance would we tolerate before we begin to doubt that an event is real? Are we troubled by our inability to locate this event comfortably either in the category real life or in the category theatre? Similarly, are we troubled by our inability to locate it in category private or public or sincere, ironic? Does this lead us to look again at those distinctions and to ask whether, instead, there is a continuum between them, upon which all the things that humans do in the sight of other humans are somewhere located? If we accept that, could we move on to the idea that it's possible to occupy several positions on this continuum at the same time? Can we believe that it is possible to be involved and yet to make stylistic observations about one's involvement, to manipulate a situation at the same time as being moved by it? Even though we might accept that it is, we're still left worried by the cameras. Cameras are much more of a problem for cultivated, literate people than for anyone else, because they keep raising this question. If I do something specially for the camera, haven't I told some kind of a lie, faked the past? We sense that the time machine of photography can plant into the past things that didn't quite happen, somehow eroding our sense of reality. Cameras turn us reluctantly into ironists, people who stand outside their own behavior, people who watch themselves. But just as we're suspicious of ourselves in front of the camera, we're even more suspicious of the people behind them. It's understandable. These people are designing our past. they have become the curators of our memories. That's not the only thing that disturbs us. We're unsettled by people behind cameras because we know that they're dead. And there is something unsettling about having dead people around. They're dead in the sense that they don't occupy the same present as us. What they see through their viewfinders is not the world here and now, but a picture of the world as it will appear in the future. They're already looking back at us and the event in which we are so naively embroiled from a future time and another place. They're outside. As such, they are the ultimate ironists. If you doubt this, consider the several times that cameramen have assiduously filmed their own murders. Remember the anti-Pinochet demonstration in Chile, where, through the camera, we watched a soldier raise his gun and aim directly at us. The camera held steady as the trigger finger closed, until it was suddenly thrown wildly into the air by the impact of the bullet hitting the cameraman's body. He presumably was not aware that he was there, that it was really happening. He was already watching the movie. We might call this kind of behavior courage, and perhaps one form of courage is exactly that loss of understanding. Being dead to the present, being all observer and no participant, being disembodied. But perhaps another kind of courage is the converse of that. Being simultaneously in several presents, plus a few pasts and futures as well. And yet not being either paralyzed or embarrassed by the confusion. Having the nerve to play over the whole spectrum of available possibilities, to mix and match from whatever's around, from the most revered to the most profane. I was moved by this wedding in ways that, still being rather pre-postmodern myself, I hadn't expected to be. It was a performance, a potpourri, a put-up job. But it was committed and bold and very touching because of that. In our heritage culture, where rising above your station is the high road to ridicule, that kind of experimentation is usually described as pretentious. And of course grateful that my own modest efforts in this direction have not passed totally unnoticed by the press. Actually, when I hear the word pretentious, I reach for my notebook. It normally means I'm about to see something new, or at least get so annoyed that I locate a raw nerve that I might not have known about. It's an early warning system that you'd think ought to be profusely rewarded. But its usual return is the mild disdain of all those fighting the 2,000-year war between real and synthetic, natural and artificial, authentic and fake, substance and appearance. That whole territory has turned into a tangle of muddy trenches, clamouring with antique ideological artillery. From that vantage, those who refuse to take sides, or even to make the same distinctions, seem simply irresponsible. You can fight over it forever, but it doesn't seem to get you anywhere. You still don't know how to behave in front of a camera, how to inhabit 4 different cultures in a day, where to draw the limits of your empathy, and how to live and act and jump about all of the time and still come up smiling. Anyway, it was a lovely wedding. I was totally confused.